Hello out there in virtual learning land. Welcome to another exciting rendition of Macroeconomics Online. The purpose of this video is to introduce students to a model which makes sense of the macroeconomy. So you can see here the first point is modeling GDP, unemployment, and price level. We will be building and examining the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, which will be an extremely useful macroeconomic tool because upon this model, we will make sense of the overall economy, business cycles, and use this model to explain the purpose of fiscal and monetary policy down the road. So this chapter is extremely important. Think of it as the basic building block of understanding macroeconomics. Here is the macroeconomic representation of the entire economy using the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. Notice our three variables are simultaneously being measured with the model. On the vertical axis, what are we measuring? Price level, the general price level in the economy. So we've been commonly using CPI, Consumer Price Index, a market basket of 300 goods and services purchased by the typical urban consumer, the average price level in the economy. We did note when we studied this chapter earlier on inflation that there are other measures. We could use the Producer Price Index, we could use the GDP deflator, we can employ the general price level model built by the Federal Reserve. The Consumer Price Index is straightforward, easy to understand, but notice that the vertical axis is measuring the price level in the economy. The horizontal axis is measuring simultaneously the other two important macroeconomic variables. First, real output, GDP. If you use another source to study this model, you may see the horizontal axis represented by the capital letter Y as in yellow, right? Total real output, output adjusted for inflation. Along the horizontal axis, we are also measuring the level of unemployment in the economy. So how can we measure unemployment and GDP on the same axis? Well, there's a direct relationship between the amount of real output an economy generates and the level of employment which takes place under certain economic conditions. So it makes sense that if we increase output, if real GDP rises, the level of unemployment, generally speaking, will fall, will come down, and vice versa. When real GDP contracts, the level of unemployment will rise or increase. So notice here, the three macroeconomic variables are at their long run level of perfection. We call this the Goldilocks economy. So as pictured on the model currently, we have economic growth at 3%. Real GDP, so the economy is growing at 3%. Very close to our long run average, and that's the goal for economic growth. We have unemployment of about 5%. Now remember we introduced the idea or the term full employment or the natural rate of unemployment. Some economists argue that it's closer to 4.5%. Some even argue it's close to 4%. But we're at full employment. And there is 2% inflation in the economy. So price level is increasing at the rate desirable by our nation's central bank, the Federal Reserve. This is everything's perfect in the economy, right? So how are we measuring GDP, unemployment, and inflation? Notice we have AD, downward sloping aggregate demand curve, and AS, upward sloping aggregate supply curve. At first glance, this graph looks highly similar to a single market supply and demand graph covered in chapter 3. When we examine the market for, say, potatoes, or the market for electricity, or the market for solar energy, or the market for plastic bottles or the market for rice. Make certain that you understand this is a different model. There are some similarities, but the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model is employed to understand the economy in totality. That's what aggregate means. Aggregate means in total. So aggregate demand, the downward sloping aggregate demand curve here, this green curve represents the amount of real output that all buyers want to purchase at the given price level. We will go into much more detail about aggregate demand in a few moments. Aggregate supply, the amount of real output that producers want to make available at the given price level. Equilibrium in the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model will help us determine what's happening with GDP, unemployment, and inflation. Let's talk more in detail then about aggregate demand. So aggregate demand is the amount of real output, real GDP, that all buyers collectively desire. So what do we mean by all buyers? C plus I plus G plus X. Consumer spending, consumers buy durable goods, non-durable goods, and services. Gross business investment, machines, equipment, tools, factories, plants, construction, and refurbishing equipment. Government spending, and the amount of exports purchased by citizens in other countries at the given price level. So aggregate demand is the amount of real output that all buyers collectively, C plus I plus G plus X, desire to purchase at each possible price level. So the aggregate demand curve is downward sloping because of what we call the real balances effect, the interest rate effect, and the foreign purchases effect. Therefore, we need to explain why the aggregate demand curve is downward sloping using our three explanations of the real balances effect, the interest rate effect, and the foreign purchases effect. Let's talk about the real balances effect. Today is the 29th of March 2020. Unfortunately, a lot of undesirable events are taking place in the world at the moment. Let's, for a moment, take our minds off of that and discuss what happens when things are normal in the world. So assume that someone gave you a $100,000 in cash today, the 29th of March 2020. But there was one stipulation. You were not permitted to spend any of the money for 1 year. It had to remain in a safety deposit box in the bank. So what would be bad for you during this year? Well, if the economy experienced inflation, the real balance, the purchasing power of the $100,000 would decline because the prices of goods and services are increasing. By this time next year, you would not be able to purchase as many goods and services. So you would be able to purchase fewer goods and services with the same $100,000. The real balances effect. If the economy experienced deflation, like it did during the Great Depression, your $100,000 would actually have more purchasing power 1 year from now. So this happens with some non-interest bearing or low interest bearing financial assets. Inverse relationship between changes in the price level and the purchasing power of those assets. Economists refer to this as the real balances effect. What about the interest rate effect? This graph is not in the chapter. I added it to the slides to help explain the interest rate effect. This is a graph of the domestic money market. On the horizontal axis is simply the quantity of money demanded and supplied. On the vertical axis, we don't call it the price of money, we call it the domestic real interest rates. So you see I1, I2, that's the interest rates. Let's talk first about the supply of money, the yellow vertical curve labeled supply of money. Our nation's central bank, the Federal Reserve, controls the supply of money in the economy. We will discuss the supply of money in much more detail when we cover money and banking and monetary policy in a few chapters. For now, suffice to say that our nation's central bank controls the supply of money, and there's a finite amount of money circulating in the economy. Therefore, the supply of money is vertical. The demand for money, right? People obviously need money to purchase goods and services. We will explain the demand for money in much more detail, again, later on in that chapter. But think of, okay, everybody needs money to purchase the goods and services that facilitate economic activity. What happens if the general price level of goods and services increases? So you've been buying a market basket of basic necessities at the supermarket, and every week you go shopping, this market basket costs $20. But prices of those goods and services, in this case goods, increased, and now it costs you $22 or 10% more. Well, obviously you need more money. So there'd be an increase in the demand for money. See, the demand curve shifts from the lower curve to the upper curve, and interest rates increase from I1 to I2. Why? Because you're not the only person experiencing this particular issue. Because everyone needs more money to purchase the same goods and services, there's an increase in the demand for money. Generally speaking, that will push up interest rates. So, why does that contribute to the aggregate demand curve being downward sloping? There's lots of spending in the economy, types of spending I should say, that are interest rate sensitive. When people finance cars, or when people buy homes, when businesses invest in new ventures or borrow money to finance construction projects. So generally speaking, a higher interest rate will slow some of that types of spending. That's referred to as the interest rate effect. Finally, the foreign purchase effect. This one's pretty straightforward and easy to explain. Remember our ceteris paribus, our ceteris paribus assumption. Other things equal, if the price level in the United States were to increase, citizens around the world would buy fewer of our exports, because those goods and services would be relatively more expensive to foreign individuals living in other countries. If the price level in the United States were to decrease, two things would happen. Exports would increase because citizens of other countries would find it desirable to purchase more of our goods and services, and there'd actually be fewer imports because citizens of the United States would purchase more domestic outputs. So we call that the foreign purchases effect. So all three of these contribute to the downward sloping aggregate demand curve. Now, let's talk about what doesn't contribute to the downward sloping aggregate demand curve. When we studied single market demand, we talked about the substitution effect and the income effect, right? The idea that if given the opportunity, people would substitute purchase of more of one good relative to another good when the price of the first good or service in question went down, assuming the other good did not change price. But because we're talking about aggregate demand, demand for all goods and services, there's no substitute for everything. So the substitution effect does not apply here. Likewise, there's no income effect. Why? Because remember, income varies with output. We learned that in the Keynesian chapter about macroeconomic relationships. If more GDP is produced, there'd be an increase in the level of income for citizens of the United States. If GDP were to slow, income would drop a bit. So because income varies directly with output, there's also no income effect. It's important to mention this because it helps us remember that the aggregate demand curve, although similarly shaped to a single market demand curve, is not the same thing, completely different economic idea, and is built on different economic reasoning to explain why the aggregate demand curve is downward sloping. So let's quickly review. Aggregate demand is the various amounts of real output that all buyers, consumer spending on durable goods, non-durable goods, and services, gross business investment on machinery, equipment, tools, factory, construction, government spending, and exports, desire to purchase at the given price level in the economy. It would be a good idea to draw one of these in your notebook and along the curve write C plus I plus G plus X. As a reminder that aggregate demand is made up of all four components of spending in the economy. Now, similar to when we learned about demand in Chapter 3, the aggregate demand curve will shift. It will either increase, shift to the right, or decrease, shift to the left, based on certain events and occurrences in the economy. So over the next few slides, we're going to discuss what would cause aggregate demand to increase or decrease. Let's first look at an increase in aggregate demand. So assuming current aggregate demand is pictured by the red aggregate demand labeled AD1, and something happens in the economy which causes aggregate demand to increase, there would be an initial shift to the right to the dotted line, and then a multiplied effect which causes a cumulative shift from AD1 to AD2. So it's important to remember that the multiplier has an impact or an effect on the total shift in aggregate demand. Also, make sure you understand that when we are talking about any event or action or occurrence in the economy which causes aggregate demand to increase, we're talking about aggregate demand shifting to the right. Obviously, aggregate demand could also decrease. So if we started here at AD, red aggregate demand curve, something happens which causes aggregate demand to decrease. There's going to be an initial shift to the left, initial decrease, and then the multiplied effect, which ultimately shifts aggregate demand from AD1 to AD3. Now let's talk about the factors in the economy which would shift aggregate demand. So, when we studied single market economics, we talked about the 5 non-price determinants of demand. When we are studying aggregate demand, we have to investigate which events or factors would affect consumers, and then gross business investment, and then government spending, and then net exports or export spending. So it's important to remember that these are not mutually exclusive. We explain them separately to make sense of each of the 4 components and how each of the 4 components can potentially shift the curve. But know that when something happens in the economy, it's likely to impact all 4 components. Maybe not to the same degree, but if there is an economic event which causes macroeconomic business cycle to change, it will most likely impact all 4 components of spending in some way. So let's talk about consumer spending first. The first consumer event which could affect aggregate demand is called the consumer wealth effect. So this is related to the performance of financial markets, in particular the stock market. So assume that you had $100,000 invested in the stock market in the early 90s, and you were fortunate enough to get into the market before the dot-com era and the explosion of tech companies and dot-com companies. It's not unrealistic to assume that by the end of the decade, 98, 99, your $100,000 invested in the market could have grown to $350,000 or more. So how would the significant increase in your portfolio value impact your spending? Well, typically speaking, when there's a boom in the stock market, it's going to increase aggregate demand because all investors are experiencing the same increase in the value of their portfolios or similar increases in the value of their portfolios. People that have more money, even though it's only really what we call a paper increase in your value because you haven't cashed out yet, just feel better about going on vacation or buying a boat or buying a new car. So any increase in stock market value, significant exponential increase in the stock market, tends to shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. Now, in 1999, the dot-com era came to a screeching halt and the bubble went burst. Of course, the next few years were down years for the market. Any significant drop in the stock market will also influence consumers' decisions on buying discretionary items, goods and services that they don't necessarily need, and will shift the aggregate demand curve to the left. So think about the drop, something like a 40% drop in the value of the stock market, the S&P 500, the Dow Jones Industrial Average after the 2008 financial collapse and housing bubble burst. When that happened, the consumer wealth effect was a serious drag on aggregate demand, shifting the aggregate demand curve to the left, especially for the demographic of Americans who were older. So think if you're 55 to 65 and you were saving money for retirement and you were near your retirement but you didn't cash out of the market, you might feel a little bit leery about going on vacation, buying a new car, or really engaging in any type of spending that was unnecessary because you might not feel as if you have the time to recover the losses you suffered in the stock market. All right, so the consumer wealth effect. Consumer expectations is easy to explain. Generally speaking, when people feel good or better about their financial and economic situation, they'll spend a little bit more. When individuals feel worse about their current standing as far as finances and economics, they'll spend a little bit less. The University of Michigan publishes a consumer sentiment reading every month, and this is typically considered what's called a leading economic indicator. In other words, when the number comes out, if it is an improvement, especially if it's a significant improvement, economists believe that would increase aggregate demand a bit. When the number is released at the beginning of the month or end of the month and it is negative, economists see that as a drag on consumer spending, and they would expect aggregate demand to shift somewhat to the left. We're going to explain this next one in detail on the next slide with some numbers. So household indebtedness. We're going to use some numbers to explain this. Think of it in simple terms for the moment. Normally, typically, usually, for the average American, their home is their most valuable asset. So when home values either increase or decrease, and the amount of money owed on homes relative to their value is also altered, it's going to have an impact on the amount of consumer spending which takes place. So again, we'll talk about this in more detail on the next slide, using numbers to really clarify how and why changes in home prices and household indebtedness impacts the economy. The last one is equally easy to explain, and that's simply taxes. If the government lowers taxes, it puts more disposable income in the hands of people. People will spend more money. If the government raises taxes, people will have a little bit less disposable income. People will spend a little bit less money. So a decrease in taxes will shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. An increase in taxes will shift the aggregate demand curve to the left. So let's talk about household indebtedness, and we will use a real-life example to demonstrate how house prices, home values, and household indebtedness seriously impacts the amount of consumer spending which takes place in the economy. So let's go through this scenario. Start on the left. Let's assume that Mary or Mark purchased a home in 1998 for $180,000. So you see the year is 1998. The home purchase price was $180,000. Now this man or woman, they didn't have $180,000, so they put a down payment on the house of $30,000, and they financed the remaining $150,000 with a 30-year fixed rate mortgage. That's the typical approach most people take to purchasing a home. Most people don't have the cash or the financial wherewithal to cover the price of a home, so they get a loan against the value of the home to purchase the home. That's called a mortgage. Okay, so I used a mortgage calculator to determine these numbers, so these are accurate numbers. In 1998, you could acquire a 30-year fixed rate mortgage for 7.875%. Now, it's important to talk about this for a moment. The market determines the interest rates, right? The supply of money, the demand for money, the current economic situation in the U.S. economy determines the interest rate. So as a borrower, let's assume that there was the best interest rate available. You had good credit, you had good paying job, you had good income history. So the bank is offering you the best possible rate they can based on the interest rates that are available at the time. We will talk in much more detail about how interest rates are determined when we study the lessons of monetary policy. But this was the going rate in 1998 for a 30-year fixed rate mortgage. Now, very quickly, maybe some of you don't have much background on what we mean by a 30-year fixed rate mortgage. So the way this would work is that Mary or Mark borrows $150,000, and they have to pay the money back over 30 years. And you take the 7.875%, you put that into the mortgage calculator. That's the interest rate, right? The principal is $150,000, and then it creates what's called an amortization schedule. So what this means is that the borrower, Mary or Mark, would make a payment of $1,088 per month for 360 months. 30 times 12, 30 years times 12 months. The payment would be the same fixed rate mortgage over that time period. Now, if you're a finance major, or even if you're just interested in how this works, even though the payment remains the same over the 30 years, the amortization schedule identifies how much of that money is going to principal and how much is going to interest. So the first few years of the loan, most of that money is going to interest. In other words, the bank gets its payment back first. The bank gets its money back first. So the first payment of $1,088 that this borrower makes, $1,000 might be in interest and only $88 is in principal. And then the next month, only say $990 is interest, and the rest goes to principal. But the payment remains the same. All right, so now that we have that all clarified, let's go 8 years down the road. All right. Now, Mary or Mark faithfully pay their mortgage every month for 8 years. They kept their job. They probably received a nice increase in pay over time because they're doing a good job at their employer, right, with their employer. So their occupational history continues to improve. Their credit standing continues to improve. So they're in decent financial shape. prices of homes in their neighborhood begin to escalate. So it sees there, it says home value 340,000, 340K. So by 2006, the average home price in their neighborhood has increased to $340,000. Again, that's determined by the market, buyers and sellers, how much people want to pay for a house. So this could potentially be good for Mary or Mark. Why? Well, there's a process called a cash out refinance, and really just involves contacting a lender where you tell the bank or the lender that you're interested in getting a new mortgage at the current interest rate in the economy. Now notice here it says that interest rate in the economy at 2006 was 3.625%. So interest rates had fallen quite substantially. This is one of the driving forces of the housing bubble, actually. Interest rates were ridiculously low, right? So you call, as a potential borrower, Mark or Mary, they call their bank and they say, I want to refinance my house. I want to take advantage of this lower interest rate. But here's the interesting thing. The bank will let you borrow 80% of your home's value. Now, how do they come up with the value of a home, or how do they assess the value of the home? They'll look at the last 10 homes sold in your neighborhood, and they'll look at the average price of those 10 homes, and that will help them determine the value of your home. And then when you actually go to get the loan, they'll send someone out to appraise your home. So let's assume these numbers are accurate. So Mary or Mark's house is worth $340,000, right? The bank will allow them to borrow 80% of that. So they borrow $260,000. Now, the bank's not going to let you have two mortgages. When you get that new loan for $260,000, that new 30-year mortgage for $260,000, you have to pay off the balance of your old loan. So notice there it says $140,000 balance of first mortgage. So you take the $260,000 of the new loan that you're originating in 2006, right? You pay off the old loan. Then there's some cost involved with making this happen, because there has to be what's called a title search and an appraisal and a bunch of other paperwork and such. So let's just go high on that and say that those costs are $10,000. So you borrow $260,000 at 3.625%. You pay off the old loan, you pay the closing costs, and you actually walk away with a check for $110,000, right? So that's called a cash out refinance. That individual, Mary or Mark, is tapping into the equity in their home. This is perfectly legal. There's no taxes on that money. It's your money. So they literally write you a check, cut you a check at closing when you sign all the papers for the loan for $110,000. So think about the spending power that Mary or Mark now has in their pocket. All right, probably not a good idea to go to Vegas or a racetrack, but maybe you could do something intelligent with that money. So also notice that what happened to the monthly payment. At the much lower interest rate, the monthly payment only went up by $98, from $1088 to $1186, right? So the burden, or the financial burden for this individual, hasn't really increased much, assuming also that, it's 8 years down the road, they're probably making a bit more money. Plus, they could do something really intelligent with that money. What if they took the $110,000 and they bought a small condominium for say $95,000, and they rented it out for say $800 a month? Well, look, now you can say, okay, $1186 minus $800, the rental income they're receiving. Well, they're really only paying $386 of their own mortgage now, right? Unfortunately, a lot of people did things that weren't intelligent with those cash out refinance checks, like went on vacations, bought a yacht, improved their kitchen, which is a good idea, but to some extent not a good idea, because home improvements are good, but you're never going to recoup all of the money you put into the home, right? But here's the point that's important for us. Mary or Mark was not the only person doing this in 2006. Hundreds of millions of Americans were tapping into the equity of their home at much lower interest rates to spend money, right? Now that shifted aggregate demand to the right significantly. So in the late 90s, early 2000s, this cash out refinance system process was a boom for the economy, right? A boom for the economy. Serious shift in aggregate demand curve to the right. Unfortunately, all of this went bust in 2007, right? So in 2007, home prices started to collapse, and a lot of people were what's called underwater on their mortgages, right? Now, this might not matter to Mary or Mark because they owe 260, and even if home prices come all the way back down to 260, they're not in too bad a shape, right? They're not in too bad a shape because, hey, like, okay, I owe 260 on a house that's now worth 260, but they were smart to buy that other condo, and they're getting a rental income, and they didn't really stretch their finances too far because they're only paying an extra $100 per month. So this might not be a big problem for Mary or Mark, but what about the people who bought homes in 2006 at the market value of 340, and the homes are now worth only 260, right? So by 2008, 2009, home prices come back down to a reasonable level from 340 down to say 260, right? Well, what if you owe $339,000 in 2008 or 2009 on a home that's only worth $260,000? You're what's called underwater. In other words, the value of the home is worth less than the mortgage you still owe on it, the balance of the mortgage or the remaining mortgage balance. Now you understand why the housing collapse was such a detrimental event for the economy. Many individuals decided to let the bank foreclose on their homes, and this was bad for banks because banks don't want to be, they're losing money on every home they foreclose on. And it also further reduces or suppresses home prices, and it's a huge drag on aggregate demand. This is why household indebtedness is one of the most important consumer effects or factors to evaluate when you talk about its effect on aggregate demand, right? So the boom in home prices was excellent for aggregate demand. The collapse in home prices was seriously detrimental for aggregate demand. A serious drop in aggregate demand caused by the housing collapse. C plus I plus G plus X. Remember, I, gross business investment, businesses purchasing capital, is actually the most important component of GDP. It's the driving force behind all economic activity. So when you think about investment spending made by businesses, it has a significant multiplier effect on the economy. Any increase in planned business investment shifts the aggregate demand curve to the right. Any decrease in planned business investment shifts the aggregate demand curve to the left. Remember, an increase in aggregate demand caused by an increase in investment spending has a multiplied effect on the economy, and vice versa. This slide shows us investment spending as a percentage of GDP, and this goes back to 2004, but the levels haven't changed much. In other words, even though it's 2020, Roughly speaking, gross business investment is still 16% of GDP in the United States. We talked about this slide prior to this video in the last lecture. It traces the volatility of investment over time, and it traces the volatility of investment over time relative to economic output. So the horizontal axis is simply time from 1971 to 2004. The vertical axis is the percentage change in both real GDP, the blue line, and gross business investment, the red line. Remember, gross business investment is a leading economic indicator and a driving force in changes in overall economic activity because of the multiplied effect it has on the economy. So we discussed how the aggregate demand curve could increase or decrease based on 4 factors for consumers, right? We talked about the consumer wealth effect. We talked about consumer expectations. We talked about household taxes. And we spent a significant amount of time outlining household indebtedness. Then we evaluated investment spending and the relationship between the real rate of interest and the expected rate of return and some of the other factors of impact the amount of planned business investment which takes place. Now we talk about government spending. And look, there's nothing under government spending. Move right on to net exports. But trust me, changes in government spending have a big impact on aggregate demand. Here's what you should write in your notes. You should write under government spending, how does government spending either increase or decrease economic activity through shifting aggregate demand to the right or to the left, increase or decrease. Write down the words fiscal policy. The entire next chapter is dedicated to this topic, how changes in government spending ultimately affect aggregate demands, how governments increase spending during economic downturns to entice more economic activity, right? So it's not that this isn't important. It's actually extremely important, but it's the focus of the entire next chapter. Therefore, we can move on to net exports and talk about the 2 factors from export spending which impact aggregate demand. Okay, so the second one you already know, the one in red, exchange rates. This one is something we covered when we entertained our study of international economics. Other things equal, if the dollar depreciates relative to the value of other currencies, this would be good for U.S. exports. So if the dollar were to depreciate against the value of the euro, we would expect Europeans to find American exports relatively less expensive, and exports to Europe should increase, right? Dollar appreciates against, say, the Japanese yen. That would be bad for U.S. exports, and we would expect less Japanese citizens purchasing goods and or services produced by Americans. So it's a simple idea. A depreciating dollar against other currencies increases aggregate demand. And remember, by a multiplied effect. An appreciating dollar makes exports relatively more expensive to citizens in other countries and therefore decreases aggregate demand. The other point here is extremely important. Remember, economics is a social science. This is one of those lessons that applies to many people who are, let's say, less than aware of what's taking place in the world, right? Economics is a social science. National income abroad. What this is telling us, it's not us against them. We learned this very on in this course, right? Economics is not a zero-sum game. I'm not made better off at your expense. A rising tide lifts all boats. It's extremely beneficial for the U.S. economy, especially given the collaborative nature of the global economy and the collective outcome of countries, modern industrialized countries. It's good for the United States when Germany, France, Japan, China, Brazil, when their economies perform well, because citizens and workers in those countries have more money to spend, because when the economy does better, jobs are more plentiful incomes rise, people will spend more money domestically, but those citizens will also spend more money internationally. So we as Americans want nations across the world to do better because income increases in other nations will ultimately increase aggregate demand. There'll be more export activity for the good old US of A. Of course, when there's an economic downturn and people in other countries have to tighten their belts, so to speak, that will be bad for exports and bad for the US economy. Now that we have thoroughly explained aggregate demand, we need to talk about the other side of the economy, aggregate supply, right? So let's first define what we mean by aggregate supply, right? So when we studied individual markets in chapter 3, we talked about, the market for, say, cotton, and supply was determined by every one of the agricultural businesses involved with growing and selling cotton, right? So now we're talking about all businesses, right? Of every industry in the entire nation. So in total, aggregate supply, right? So it's the level of real output, the level of domestic output that the producers, all the sellers, whether it's a multi-billion-dollar corporation or it's a tiny bakery in some town in Iowa, right? The level of real output that all producers want to make available at each possible price level. Now, there are two aggregate supply curves. We will look at both of these graphically. The long run aggregate supply curve, which is vertical at the full employment level of output, and the one we will spend 98% of our time concentrating on and studying and using to make sense of the economy, the short run aggregate supply curve. So, if you remember from the John Maynard Keynes video and the Great Depression, there was a group of economists called classical theorists. Classical theorists are disciples of Adam Smith. They believe in the power of markets, and they believe that laissez-faire economics is the best approach to organizing the economic resources of a nation. And generally speaking, they are correct. There are significant benefits to using capitalism to organize your economic system. We already talked about externalities and some of the problems with capitalism. But here's the idea that in the long run, when markets have time to adjust, that there is a match between wages and resource prices, between wages and the resource price level. So in the long run, you can think about that, how much people are getting paid and the prices of goods and services they need to consume. Given enough time to adjust, they will actually be equal. And therefore, the long run aggregate supply curve, or the amount of real output that all producers want to make available for sale, it will be equal to or vertical at full employment domestic output. Think of this in terms of the production possibility frontier. In other words, collectively, businesses will produce the maximum level of output achievable given the resources on hand at the time. But as John Maynard Keynes pointed out, there are periods of time when we have a serious mismatch, when wages and resource prices don't even come close, or do not even come close to matching. So therefore, we're going to spend a great deal of our efforts studying what's called the short run aggregate supply curve and explain what's going on with our three macroeconomic variables using the short run aggregate supply curve and short run aggregate demand curve. That's the period of time in the short run aggregate supply when wages and resource prices do not match. John Maynard Keynes had a realistic view of the world. He agreed with the classical theorists that in the long run, there would be a match between resource prices and wages. But he said in the long run, we're also all dead. He realized that the long run could be a long time. So, therefore, why not concentrate our efforts on short run and discuss possibilities of government intervention and monetary intervention in the short run. Therefore, we are going to use mostly the short run aggregate supply curve to explain the level of real output that producers want to make available at each possible level of prices. But let's first look at the long run aggregate supply curve. So notice, like I said on the previous slide, you can see this graphically. The picture tells 1,000 stories, right? Notice the long run aggregate supply curve is vertical at full employment level of output, QF. What we're saying here is that given enough time to adjust, the economy will produce the level of goods and services where wages and resource prices match, and companies are producing at maximum level of potential output based on limited resources, which should make sense in the long run, especially considering the ideas and principles we covered earlier in the term or in the semester. Let's assume John Maynard Keynes is correct in that we should concentrate our efforts in solving macroeconomic problems or issues in the short run, because in the long run we know what is inevitable. So this, my friends, is the short run aggregate supply curve. Now notice this is the exaggerated or extended version of the short run aggregate supply curve. It looks highly similar to the short run aggregate supply curve we used earlier in the lecture on the first slide to explain what's going on in the macroeconomic economy. But this extended or exaggerated version helps us understand the nature and shape of the curve. So in the short run aggregate supply curve, we have what's called the Keynesian range, the intermediate or business cycle range, and then the upward sloping classical range. Now, if you have been paying attention, you might recognize the shape of this curve and say, this looks a lot like the graph we used to explain inflation. And then it exactly is. So when we covered the chapter on unemployment and inflation, we introduced this graph without calling it the short run aggregate supply curve, because at the time we had not covered enough material. So if you remember that particular lecture and the points associated with that lecture, all of this should be reviewed to you, okay? So here is our explanation of the short run aggregate supply curve. Now remember, on the vertical axis we have price level. On the horizontal axis we're measuring both GDP/economic output and the level of domestic employment. In other words, how many people are working. So we have the horizontal range, the upward sloping intermediate range, and then the vertical classical range of the short run aggregate supply curve. Remember what's taking place here in the horizontal range. Well, look, first of all, anywhere along this range we see that there's no pressure on price level, right? This is called the Keynesian range because it represents an economy that is far from its potential level of output. In other words, we're in a recession. In other words, there's an economic downturn, which means there's a great deal of capacity underutilization. There's a lot of economic resources, specifically land and capital, which are laying idle on the sidelines, which are not being put to work or put to use, right? So the key idea here in the horizontal range is that there's a lot of what we call slack in the economy, a lot of excess capacity utilization, which is not being employed towards economic output, right? So in this range we have GDP, which is falling or negative relative to the previous periods. We have a high level of unemployment, and there's no upward pressure on prices for two reasons. Number one is that producers aren't going to raise prices of goods and services when they are struggling to receive orders for the goods and services they produce and sell. All right. Likewise, producers aren't demanding as many resources, land, capital, and labor, so there's no upward pressure on prices of resources. So if you think back to the circular flow model, and you talk about two types of markets, the resource market and the product/services market, there's no upward pressure on prices, right? People are out of jobs, so they're not buying things they don't need. They're not pushing up prices of things because they have a lot of excess cash laying around or excess income. And resource prices are relatively low at the moment. So the horizontal range characterized by capacity underutilization, a lot of slack in the economy. But eventually producers get encouraged to produce more, the upward sloping intermediate range. Right? And this is where we typically operate somewhere in this range. So notice what happens throughout the intermediate upward sloping range. First, it's curved, which means that as economic activity picks up, so does the price level. Right, so does the price level. In other words, we have some inflation, which is a healthy byproduct of a normal economy. So producers are willing to make available more for sale at a given price level because they feel better about profit expectations. Right? GDP increases, unemployment starts to fall, producers make more available for sale. Right? Eventually, we hit our proverbial wall, the vertical range. So notice, in the vertical range, the level of domestic output cannot increase anymore. There's no more capacity underutilization. There's no more slack. There's no more resources on the sideline being waiting to be put to use, right? So we're at our potential economic output as a nation, right? Now, one good question when you revisit the horizontal range is, why do we typically not have deflation? We'll have periods of disinflation where the level of inflation falls, but we don't really have periods of deflation. And the reason for that is because when you think about the cost of labor, a lot of cost of labor is fixed in the sense of minimum wages, right? And also the idea that if you lay off people, let's say at 100 employees and you keep 60 of them, it's really difficult to reduce their wages because they're not going to work maybe as hard if they get a little bit less wage. All right, so now we understand the shape of the short run aggregate supply curve. Let's talk about what would shift the curve. So changes in aggregate supply. So we have these three ranges of the short run aggregate supply curve. The horizontal range, the intermediate range, and the upward sloping range. So what would cause aggregate supply to decrease or increase? Well, the increase is easy to explain, right? What do we mean by that? Remember the production possibility frontier, and we talked about economic growth. So any increases in productivity will shift the aggregate supply curve to the right. Any technological advancements which improves the methodology of production for any industry or across the board will shift the production possibility frontier will shift the aggregate supply curve to the right, right? Any technological improvement, any discovery of more resources, any decrease in the price of resources because there's more available will shift the aggregate supply curve to the right. And any shift of the aggregate supply curve to the right caused by lower input costs, technological advancements, or productivity, that's the best case scenario for the economy. Now, what would shift the aggregate supply curve to the left? A decrease in aggregate supply. Well, remember, we called this situation or event cost push inflation. So, typically associated with what's called a negative supply shock, a serious increase in the price of a necessary resource, typically something like oil, right? So the aggregate supply curve would shift to the left, a decrease in aggregate supply, if we had a negative supply shock. So when you think about the real economy and you look at AS1, what we're hoping for as analysts of macroeconomic activity in the greater economy is any event or occurrence which will shift the curve to the right. More or better resources, an improvement in technology, a decrease in the price of resources. All of those will shift the aggregate supply curve to the right. We will list these on the next few slides just to review these ideas. So, if you have more resource available domestically, so if you think about the fracking boom and the directional drilling availability of oil and natural gas, significant increase in resource availability, right? That will shift the aggregate supply curve to the right. Right? And of course, this applies to all resources, land, labor. So if we had an increase in the number of people living in the United States, that would shift the aggregate supply curve to the right. Even an improvement in labor resources, right? So a better educated workforce. If we decide to revisit our policy with immigration and we allowed more doctors and more healthcare workers and more I don't know, people who are willing to do any type of manual labor, that would shift the aggregate supply curve to the right. Right? Any increases or improvements in capital. So think technological advancements that improve capital, shift the aggregate supply curve to the right. Right? Obviously smarter, innovative people. Any increase in that, shift the aggregate supply curve to the right. Then finally, the price of imported resources. When you talk about imported resources, right? So if you're a company and you import land or capital from another nation and there's a decrease in the price of those resources, that's good for the short-run aggregate supply curve in the United States. Final idea is some degree of this is that if you think about the large companies in the U.S. economy, companies such as Walmart, companies such as Amazon, right? The giant behemoths, they can drive efficiency because they have market power and they can, we won't use the word force, they can coerce producers of inputs to look for ways to cut costs because they're the number one buyer in the market for those types of resources. So what other factors may influence the average supply curve and either increase or decrease the average supply curve, shift the curve to the right, an increase in the short run average supply curve, or a decrease in the average supply curve? One big component is what economists refer to as productivity. Any business majors out there should pay particular attention to this particular concept. Businesses are constantly looking for means to improve efficiency. The most effective method of or means of improving efficiency is to get more output for each unit of inputs. So when you look at the calculation or the concept of productivity, it's a measurement of how much output is generated per unit of input. Now you can measure this in terms of labor, you can measure this in terms of capital. For those who are math inclined, it gets a little more involved when you introduce more than one variable, but math aside, the principle or the idea is not all that difficult to understand, right? In other words, if you have 10 workers and you're making 100 units per day, well, the factory would be much better served if with those same 10 workers, you could produce 120 units per day. So the question is, what drives productivity? What increases productivity? And a real issue for the economy of 2020 is why have productivity increases or improvements been so lackluster, especially against the backdrop of increases in personal technological devices and such. So productivity is a real important idea for the concept of it drives economic growth, it shifts the supply curve to the right, and we're getting more out of every unit of resource input. Some other relatively important ideas which could shift the curve. This idea of the legal institutional environment. So, business taxes and subsidies. Now, I'm not going to get political here, but the Trump administration passed a significant change to the legislation regarding taxes in the United States for corporate taxes, and it seemed trying to be, positive economics here, not normative economics, trying to be fair and trying to be, making an honest, objective assessment of the policy. It didn't make sense that American producers were at a competitive or comparative disadvantage to international producers because they were forced to pay a higher corporate tax rate in the United States. So leveling the tax playing field was good for America's economy, and that type of legislation change should improve and should shift the aggregate supply curve to the right. Subsidies, obviously, when you think about wind or solar, industries that in and of themselves could not compete against existing firms, especially in the energy industry, any increase in subsidies will be good for the overall economy, shift the aggregate supply curve to the right. And government regulation is really just a generalization of those same ideas. So let's bring these together again. This is the same sort of graph we talked about, right, on the first slide of the video. When you have short-run aggregate supply and short-run aggregate demand, we are able to determine the level of GDP, unemployment, and inflation. So bringing this all together, it is vitally important you understand the purpose of the model. Equilibrium in the macro sense tells us, helps us identify what's going on with the economy, right? Now, this is the perfect picture. The macroeconomic equilibrium occurring in this slide is the overall goal of our economy. We constantly want the economy to be growing at or near 3% and unemployment to be near 4.5%, or natural rate of unemployment, or the full employment number. And we like inflation, the increase in the price level, to be at or near 2%. So that's the goal. So think in these terms. Let's assume this is the economy and everything is perfect, that we are growing at or near our long-run average growth rate of 3%, and unemployment's a healthy 4.37%, and inflation's manageable 1.8%. So everything's hunky-dory, happy-go-lucky, perfect. Well, the question is, what can disrupt the course of perfection, right? So think it in these terms. We already discussed in detail what would shift the aggregate demand or aggregate supply curve. What will increase aggregate demand or decrease aggregate demand? We talked about consumer features of household indebtedness, the consumer wealth effect. We talked about taxes, and we talked about consumer expectations. From the standpoint of businesses, we talked about the expected rate of return versus the real rate of interest, and we talked about changes in capacity and such. Those type of things will shift the aggregate supply curve, the aggregate demand curve from the standpoint of business spending. Government changes their spending based on what's occurring in the economy. We'll talk about fiscal policy in more detail. Then we talked about the national income abroad and the idea of exchange rates, which affect the amount of exports. So all those factors could either increase or decrease aggregate demand. And remember, they generally work together when something happens in the economy. So here's the thing. If this is the perfect picture of what's taking place in the economy, any change from this particular macroeconomic situation will be bad. So a significant increase in demand, aggregate demand, would be bad. A significant decrease in aggregate demand would also be bad. Here's the interesting thing when we talk about aggregate supply. Any leftward shift or decrease in aggregate supply, a negative supply shock, that would be horrific. That would be really bad for the economy. The only possible shift which could be beneficial for the economy is a rightward shift or increase in aggregate supply. So again, think of this as, okay, here's the Goldilocks situation. This is where we want macroeconomic equilibrium to take place all the time. What happens if and when we get off track, right? What will the picture be then of macroeconomic equilibrium? And then what would it do to our measurement of GDP, unemployment, and inflation? So let's discuss the 4 possible shifts in aggregate demand or aggregate supply and how that impacts GDP, unemployment, and inflation. Okay, so what do we have pictured here? Look what has happened to our picture of perfection. The aggregate demand curve has shifted well left, right? So if you think about the previous slide and what this picture is telling us, what this graph is demonstrating, all right, so what's happened? Okay, from where we were, GDP has contracted quite a bit. Right? We are well left of full employment domestic level of output. So if GDP is dropping, if it's contracting, if the economy is shrinking as far as the level of output, unemployment is rising. Notice in range 1 that there's very little chance of what we call deflation. In other words, we can have a decrease in the general price level from, say, 2.2% inflation down to 1.7 or 1.5 or 1.3. But generally speaking, we don't see deflationary pressures all that often. Now, it could happen, but it's been since the Great Depression when we actually experienced deflation. And the reason for that is, economists believe that in some sense, prices are what we call rigid. And that has to do, again, with the idea that minimum wage laws, and most of the time when there are people living through the recession, they receive unemployment benefits, so they have some spending power. And the people that retain their jobs typically don't get significant decreases in their wages. So that all translates into businesses not really reducing prices all that much. Now again, it's not across the board. It's just in most of the occurrence. So what could cause the aggregate demand curve to shift well left? Well, any of the factors affecting consumer spending and gross business investment. Those are the real factors to watch. Now, of course, net exports are 12% or close to that of GDP. So net exports are important. So national incomes abroad or exchange rates, they could have impact the economy. But generally speaking, we're going to be looking at factors such as a significant drop in household wealth caused by a serious drop in the level or value of the stock market, household indebted rising this because of a housing collapse, much like 2008, a significant drop in investment spending because businesses don't see any profitable opportunities on the horizon, or a combination of those factors, right? Now, it would be remiss of me to not mention this because, again, economics is a social science, and we're dealing with the unfortunate reality of the COVID-19 situation, right? So we went from perfect economy. We're talking, 3-4 weeks ago in February when we had unemployment about 3.6%, economic growth rate in the high 2% something growth rate, inflation very manageable 1.8%, and all of a sudden we're dealing with severe recession because the virus is forcing production to come to a halt, right? So you have a serious drop in gross business investment spending and a significant drop in consumer spending, and that's pushing us into a recession. Now, the interesting thing about analyzing this as an economist is first of all, it's unprecedented, and it's not a man-made problem like your typical downward forces of a business cycle, such as asset bubbles or financial monetary issues, or lack of innovation or such. These are powers beyond our control. Now, it's good to look at this using the aggregate supply curve from the book, right? So I like the exaggerated short-run aggregate supply curve, but this is the same idea here. A decrease in aggregate demand caused by any of the issues we outlined on the previous slide with consumer investment spending, right? And the result is a drop in output from QF to Q2, so GDP falling. With GDP falling, you see that unemployment will rise, right? And then we'll see price level come down. But look, when we talk about price level going from P1 to P2, it doesn't mean we have deflation. It means we have disinflation, right? So spend some time with these shifts, and you'll get to understand these ideas. The next possible issue that we could deal with, which seems like something we'd like to be dealing with now because of the current situation in the world, but what if we have this situation, what's called too much money chasing too few goods? So what's happened here? You see that aggregate demand, spending by consumers and investment spending, has become excessive. We have too much money chasing too few goods, which means that spending in the economy in the private sector is outpacing the economy's ability to produce, right? Private sector spending is outpacing the economy's ability to produce. Now, why does it create, or why does it cause inflation? Why is this excess spending only create higher price level and not increased output? Well, look what happens when spending, aggregate demand, increases beyond range 2. Notice that the economy has a limited capacity to produce. So in range 3, we notice that we're at our potential economic output. We're putting all the land, capital, and labor resources to work. Maybe we're operating factories 8 hours, 10 hours, maybe we're even pushing it longer, right? So the problem is just the basic issue with economics. Limited economic resources, unlimited economic wants. In the short run, we don't have access to any more land, capital, and labor. So any increase in spending, which outpaces the economy's ability to produce, causes demand pull inflation, where price level rises up to P1, right? GDP doesn't really increase anymore because we've hit the proverbial wall, our limit of capacity, and unemployment's not a problem here because unemployment can be in the low 4s or high 3%. That's not the issue. So demand pull inflation caused by too much money chasing too few goods, excess spending beyond the economy's ability to produce. Right? The byproduct is GDP leveling off at its maximum possible rate of growth for the time. Unemployment not an issue, below our full employment level or a natural unemployment rate. But price level, significant increase in price level. Inflation is the issue. Again, I like to use the exaggerated short-run aggregate supply curve to really drive home the ideas of demand pull inflation and the recession and the effects on GDP, unemployment, and inflation price level. But here's the graph from the book, right? So you feel more comfortable and say, okay, where are we getting this? So here we have the same idea, right? We started at AD1AS, where we had P1QF. Everything was perfect in the world. We had economic growth at about 3.1, 3.2%. We have unemployment about 4%, and we have inflation of about 2%. Notice that when spending becomes excessive, yeah, output may increase a teeny bit, right? But the increase in spending causes unwanted increase in price level. Demand pull inflation. So this graph shows the same thing as the previous graph, but the previous graph really drives home the idea of an economy only has a certain capacity to produce. Now, the worst case scenario for the U.S. economy. Let's assume we're at full employment domestic output, right? P1QF. Everything's perfect. GDP is humming along at 2.9% growth. Unemployment's at 4.25%, and inflation is a manageable 2.1%. And then we have this negative supply shock. Right, well, there's a decrease in aggregate supply caused by price of a barrel of oil going from $25 a barrel to $75 a barrel, right? Now, this was a serious worry when the United States was a manufacturer-based economy and oil was 33% of our inputs. So if you look at all the land, capital, labor that the United States used, 33% of the economic engine depended on oil, right, as an input. So that negative supply shock creates what's called cost push inflation. Now, why is this the worst of all scenarios? Look what happens from QF to Q1. Well, obviously, GDP, economic output, drops. So if GDP is falling, if we're contracting the economic activity of the economy, then obviously unemployment begins to rise, right? Which is bad in and of itself. But at the same time, we also have to fight the other macroeconomic issue. Look what happens. Not only are we dealing with a recession where GDP is contracting and unemployment is rising, price levels are also rising at the same time from P1 up to P2. Hence the term cost push inflation, a new term invented by economists to discuss or describe this particular era of time. It was called stagflation. Stag from the idea of the economy being stagnant, where GDP was dropping and unemployment rising, and inflation from the idea of price levels going up at the same time. So we have looked at three scenarios, and all three were bad. A decrease in aggregate demand generally pushes us in a recession. An increase in aggregate demand, assuming we started at full employment domestic output or a Goldilocks scenario, creates demand pull inflation. Right? A decrease in aggregate supply, if and when we started at that perfect scenario again, creates cost push inflation. So the only possible shift, the only shift in aggregate supply or aggregate demand which is beneficial for the economy is a rightward shift or an increase in aggregate supply. Right? Now we already talked about what factors would increase aggregate supply. Any improvements in productivity, any increases in availability of resources, any decrease in the price of domestic or international resources, right? All of those would be good. Now, why is this the best case scenario? Any increase in aggregate supply caused by improvements in productivity or the availability and price of resources or technological advancements creates what economists refer to as non-inflationary economic growth. In other words, we're able to grow the economy, produce more goods and services, provide more jobs, and there's no upward pressure on prices because it's caused by an increase in aggregate supply. All right, excellent work this video. We will revisit these concepts and we will employ all the tools of an understanding of aggregate supply, aggregate demand in further videos when we study fiscal and monetary policy. So really review these economic principles and concepts that are important moving forward.